It was while gathering material for Women and Work that Freddie received his first warning of the danger he was in. He was too successful at living in both worlds. This strange dualism he had developed was after all very unstable, and, as he sat in his study and meditated, he saw that it could not endure. It was really a transition stage, and if he persisted, he saw that he would inevitably have to drop one world or the other. He could not continue in both. And as he looked at the row of volumes that graced the upper shelf of his revolving bookcase, his volumes, beginning with his thesis and ending with Women and Work, he decided that that was the world he would hold to and stick by. Bill Tots had served his purpose, but he had become a too dangerous accomplice. Bill Tots would have to cease. Freddie Drummond's fright was due to Mary Condon, president of the International Glove Workers Union No. 974. He had seen her first from the Spectators Gallery at the annual convention of the Northwest Federation of Labour, and he had seen her through Bill Tots' eyes, and that individual had been most favourably impressed by her. She was not Freddie Drummond's sort at all. What if she were a royal-bodied woman, graceful and sinewy as a panther, with amazing black eyes that could fill with fire or laughter love, as the mood might dictate? He detested women with a too exuberant vitality and a lack of inhibition. Freddie Drummond accepted the doctrine of evolution because it was quite universally accepted by college men, and he flatly believed that man had climbed up the ladder of life out of the weltering muck and mess of lower and monstrous organic things. But he was a trifle ashamed of his genealogy and preferred not to think of it. Wherefore probably he practiced his iron inhibition and preached it to others and preferred women of his own type who could shake free of this bestial and regrettable ancestral line, and by discipline and control emphasized the wideness of the gulf that separated them from what their dim forebears had been. Bill Tots had none of these considerations. He had liked Mary Condon from the moment his eyes first rested on her in the convention hall, and he had made it a point then and there to find out who she was. The next time he met her, and quite by accident, was when he was driving an express wagon for Pat Morrissey. It was in a lodging house in Mission Street where he had been called to take a trunk into storage. The landlady's daughter had called him and led him to the little bedroom, the occupant of which, a glove maker, had just been removed to hospital. But Bill did not know this. He stooped, upended the trunk, which was a large one, got it on his shoulder and struggled to his feet with his back toward the open door. At that moment he heard a woman's voice. "Belong to the union?" was the question asked. "What's it to you?" he retorted. "Run along now and get out of my way. I want to turn around." The next he knew, big as he was whirled half around and sent reeling backward, the trunk overbalancing him till he fetched up with a crash against the wall. He started to swear, but at the same instant found himself looking into Mary Condon's flashing, angry eyes. "Of course I belong to the union," he said. "I was only kidding you." "Where's your card?" she demanded in a business-like tone. "In my pocket, but I can't get it out now. The trunk's too damn heavy. Come on down to the wagon and I'll show it to you." "Put that trunk down," was the command. "What for? I got a card, I'm telling you." "Put it down, that's all. No scab's going to handle that trunk. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, you big coward, scabbing on honest men. Why don't you just join the union and be a man?" Mary Condon's colour had left her face, and it was apparent that she was in a rage. "Think of a big man like you turning traitor to his class. I suppose you're aching to join the militia for a chance to shoot down union drivers the next strike. You may belong to the militia already, for that matter. You're the sort—" "Hold on now, that's too much." Bill dropped the trunk to the floor with a bang, straightened up and thrust his hand into his inside coat pocket. "I told you I was only kidding. There, look at that." It was a union card, properly enough. "All right, take it along," Mary Condon said, "and the next time don't kid." Her face relaxed as she noticed the ease with which he got the big trunk to his shoulder, and her eyes glowed as they glanced over the graceful massiveness of the man. But Bill did not see that. He was too busy with the trunk. The next time he saw Mary Condon was during the laundry strike. The laundry workers, but recently organised, were green at the business and had petitioned Mary Condon to engineer the strike. Freddie Drummond had had an inkling of what was coming and had sent Bill Tots to join the union and investigate. Bill's job was in the washroom, and the men had been called out first that morning in order to stiffen the courage of the girls, and Bill chanced to be near the door to the mangle room when Mary Condon started to enter. The superintendent, who was both large and stout, barred her way. He wasn't going to have his girls called out, and he'd teach her a lesson to mind her own business. And as Mary tried to squeeze past him, he thrust her back with a hand on her shoulder. She glanced around and saw Bill. "Here you, Mr. Tot," she called. "Lend a hand, I want to get in." Bill experienced a startle of warm surprise. She had remembered his name from his union card. The next moment the superintendent had been plucked from the doorway, raving about rights under the law, and the girls were deserting their machines. During the rest of the short and successful strike, Bill constituted himself Mary Condon's henchman and messenger, and when it was over returned to the university to be Freddie Drummond and to wonder what Bill Tots could see in such a woman. Freddie Drummond was entirely safe, but Bill had fallen in love. There was no getting away from the fact of it, and it was this fact that had given Freddie Drummond his warning. Well, he had done his work, and his adventures could cease. There was no need for him to cross the slot again. All but the last 3 chapters of his latest Labour Tactics and Strategy was finished, and he had sufficient material on hand adequately to supply those chapters. Another conclusion he arrived at was that in order to sheet anchor himself as Freddie Drummond, closer ties and relations in his own social nook were necessary. It was time that he was married, anyway, and he was fully aware that if Freddie Drummond didn't get married, Bill Tots assuredly would, and the complications were too awful to contemplate. And so enters Catherine von Wurst. She was a college woman herself, and her father, the one wealthy member of the faculty, was the head of the philosophy department as well. It would be a wise marriage from every standpoint. Freddie Drummond concluded when the engagement was consummated and announced. In appearance, cold and reserved, aristocratic and wholesomely conservative, Catherine van Wurst, though warm in her way, possessed an inhibition equal to Drummond's. All seemed well with him, but Freddie Drummond could not quite shake off the call of the underworld, the lure of the free and open, of the unhampered, irresponsible life south of the slot. As the time of his marriage approached, he felt that he had indeed sowed wild oats, and he felt, moreover, what a good thing it would be if he could have but one wild fling more. Play the good fellow and the wastrel one last time, ere he settled down to grey lecture rooms with sober matrimony. And, further to tempt him, the very last chapter of Labour Tactics and Strategy remained unwritten for lack of a trifle more of essential data which he had neglected to gather. So, Freddie Drummond went down for the last time as Bill Tots, got his data, and, unfortunately, encountered Mary Condon. Once more installed in his study, it was not a pleasant thing to look back upon. It made his warning doubly imperative. Bill Tots had behaved abominably. Not only had he met Mary Condon at the Central Labour Council, but he had stopped at a chop house with her on the way home and treated her to oysters. And before they parted at her door, his arms had been about her, and he had kissed her on the lips and kissed her repeatedly. And her last words in his ear, words uttered softly with a catchy sob in the throat that was nothing more nor less than a love cry, were, "Bill, dear, dear Bill." Freddie Drummond shuddered at the recollection. He saw the pit yawning for him. He was not by nature a polygamist, and he was appalled at the possibilities of the situation. It would have to be put an end to, and it would end in one only of 2 ways. Either he must become wholly Bill Tots and be married to Mary Condon, or he must remain wholly Freddie Drummond and be married to Catherine van Wurst. Otherwise, his conduct would be beneath contempt and horrible. In the several months that followed, San Francisco was torn with labour strife. The unions and the employers' associations had locked horns with a determination that looked as if they intended to settle the matter, one way or the other, for all time. But Freddie Drummond corrected proofs, lectured classes, and did not budge. He devoted himself to Catherine van Wurst, and day by day found more to respect and admire in her, nay, even to love in her. The streetcar strike tempted him, but not so severely as he would have expected, and the great meat strike came on and left him cold. The ghost of Bill Tots had been successfully laid, and Freddie Drummond, with rejuvenescent zeal, tackled a brochure, long planned, on the topic of diminishing returns. The wedding was 2 weeks off when, one afternoon in San Francisco, Catherine van Wurst picked him up and whisked him away to see a boys' club recently instituted by the settlement workers in whom she was interested. It was her brother's machine, but they were alone with the exception of the chauffeur. At the junction with Kearney Street, Market and Geary Streets intersect like the sides of the sharp-angled letter V. They, in the auto, were coming down Market with the intention of negotiating the sharp apex and going up Geary. But they did not know what was coming down Geary, timed by fate to meet them at the apex. While aware from the papers that the meat strike was on, and that it was exceedingly bitter one, all thought of it at that moment was farthest from Freddie Drummond's mind. Was he not seated beside Catherine? And besides, he was carefully expositing to her his views on settlement work, views that Bill Totts' adventures had played a part in formulating. Coming down Geary Street were 6 meat wagons. Beside each scab driver sat a policeman. Front and rear, and along each side of this procession, marched a protecting escort of 100 police. Behind the police rear guard, at a respectful distance, was an orderly but vociferous mob several blocks in length that congested the street from sidewalk to sidewalk. The Beef Trust was making an effort to supply the hotels and, incidentally, to begin the breaking of the strike. The St. Francis had already been supplied, at a cost of many broken windows and broken heads, and the expedition was marching to the relief of the Palace Hotel. All unwitting, Drummond sat beside Catherine talking settlement work as the auto, honking methodically and dodging traffic, swung in a wide curve to get around the apex. A big coal wagon loaded with a lump coal and drawn by 4 huge horses, just debouching from Kearney Street, as though to turn down Market, blocked their way. The driver of the wagon seemed undecided, and the chauffeur, running slow but disregarding some shouting warning from the crossing policeman, swerved the auto to the left, violating the traffic rules, in order to pass in front of the wagon. At that moment, Freddie Drummond discontinued his conversation, nor did he resume it again, for the situation was developing with the rapidity of a transformation scene. He had heard the roar of the mob at the rear and caught a glimpse of the helmeted police and the lurching meat wagons. At the same moment, laying on his whip and standing up to his task, the coal driver rushed horses and wagons squarely in front of the advancing procession, pulled the horses up sharply and put on the big brake. Then he made his lines fast to the brake handle and sat down, with the air of one who had stopped to stay. The auto had been brought to a stop, too, by his big panting leaders, which had jammed against it. Before the chauffeur could back clear, an old Irishman driving a rickety express wagon and lashing his one horse to a gallop had locked wheels with the auto. Drummond recognized both horse and wagon, for he had driven them himself. The Irishman was Pat Morrissey. On the other side, a brewery wagon was locking with the coal wagon, and an eastbound Kearney streetcar, wildly clanging its gong, the motorman shouting defiance at the crossing policeman, was dashing forward to complete the blockade. And wagon after wagon was locking and blocking and adding to the confusion. The meat wagons halted, the police were trapped. The roar at the rear increased as the mob came onto the attack, while the vanguard of the police charged the obstructing wagons. "We're in for it," Drummond remarked coolly to Catherine. "Yes," she nodded with equal coolness. "What savages they are." His admiration for her doubled on itself. She was indeed his sort. He would have been satisfied with her even if she had screamed and clung to him, but this was magnificent. She sat in that storm centre as calmly as if it had been no more than a block of carriages at the opera. The police were struggling to clear a passage. The driver of the coal wagon, a big man in shirt sleeves, lighted a pipe and sat smoking. He glanced down complacently at the captain of a police who was raving and cursing at him, and his only acknowledgement was a shrug of the shoulders. From the rear, across the rat-a-tat-tat of clubs on heads and a pandemonium of cursing, yelling and shouting, a violent accession of noise proclaimed that the mob had broken through and was dragging a scab from a wagon. The police captain reinforced from his vanguard, and the mob at the rear was repelled. Meanwhile, window after window in the high office building on the right had been opened, and the class-conscious clerks were raining a shower of office furniture down on the heads of police and scabs. Waste baskets, ink bottles, paperweights, typewriters, anything and everything that came to hand was filling the air. A policeman, under orders from his captain, clambered to the lofty seat of the coal wagon to arrest the driver, and the driver, rising leisurely and peacefully to meet him, suddenly crumpled him in his arms and threw him down on the top of the cabin. The driver was a young giant, and when he climbed on his load and poised a lump of coal in both hands, a policeman, who was just scaling the wagon from the side, let go and dropped back to earth. The captain ordered 6 of his men to take the wagon. The teamster, scrambling over the load from side to side, beat them down with huge lumps of coal. The crowd on the sidewalks and the teamsters on the locked wagons roared encouragement and their own delight. The motorman, smashing helmets with his controller bar, was beaten into insensibility and dragged from his platform. The captain of the police, beside himself at the repulse of his men, led the next assault on the coal wagon. A score of police were swarming up the tall-sided fortress, but the teamster multiplied himself. At times there were 6 or 8 policemen rolling on the pavement and under the wagon. Engaged in repulsing an attack on the rear end of his fortress, the teamster turned about to see the captain just in the act of stepping onto the seat from the front end. He was still in the air and in most unstable equilibrium, when the teamster hurled a 30-pound lump of coal. It caught the captain fairly on the chest, and he went over backward, striking on a wheeler's back, tumbling onto the ground and jamming against the rear wheel of the auto. Catherine thought he was dead, but he picked himself up and charged back. She reached out her gloved hand and patted the flank of the snorting, quivering horse, but Drummond did not notice the action. He had eyes for nothing save the battle of the coal wagon, while somewhere in his complicated psychology, one Bill Tots was heaving and straining in an effort to come to life. Drummond believed in law and order and the maintenance of the established, but this riotous savage within him would have none of it. Then, if ever, did Freddie Drummond call upon his iron inhibition to save him. But it is written that the house divided against itself must fall, and Freddie Drummond found that he had divided all the will and force of him with Bill Tots, and between them the entity that constituted the pair of them was being wrenched in twain. Freddie Drummond sat in the auto, quite composed, alongside Catherine Van Vorst, but looking out of Freddie Drummond's eyes was Bill Tots, and somewhere behind those eyes, battling for the control of their mutual body, were Freddie Drummond, the same and conservative sociologist, and Bill Tots, the class-conscious and bellicose union working man. It was Bill Tots, looking out of those eyes, who saw the inevitable end of the battle on the coal wagon. He saw a policeman gain the top of the load, a second and a third. They lurched clumsily on the loose footing, but their long right clubs were out and swinging. One blow caught the teamster on the head. A second he dodged, receiving it on the shoulder. For him the game was plainly up. He dashed in suddenly, clutched 2 policemen in his arms, and hurled himself a prisoner to the pavement, his hold never relaxing on his 2 captors. Catherine Van Vorst was sick and faint at the sight of blood and brutal fighting, but her qualms were vanquished by the sensational and most unexpected happening that followed. The man beside her emitted an unearthly and uncultured yell and rose to his feet. She saw him spring over the front seat, leap to the broad rump of the wheeler, and from there gain the wagon. His onslaught was like a whirlwind. Before the bewildered officer on the load could guess the errand of this conventionally clad but excited-seeming gentleman, he was the recipient of a punch that arched him back through the air to the pavement. A kick in the face led an ascending policeman to follow his example. A rush of 3 more gained the top and locked with Bill Tots in a gigantic clinch, during which his scalp was opened up by a club, and coat, vest, and half his starched shirt were torn from him. But the 3 policemen were flung far and wide, and Bill Tots, raining down lumps of coal, held the fort. The captain led gallantly to the attack, but was bowled over by a chunk of coal that burst on his head in black baptism. The need of the police was to break the blockade in front before the mob could break in the rear, and Bill Tots' need was to hold the wagon till the mob did break through, so the battle of the coal went on. The crowd had recognized its champion. Big Bill, as usual, had come to the front, and Catherine Van Vorst was bewildered by the cries of "Bill, oh you Bill," that arose on every hand. Pat Morrissey on his wagon seat was jumping and screaming in an ecstasy. "Eat him, Bill, eat him alive!" From the sidewalk she heard a woman's voice cry out, "Look out, Bill, front end!" Bill took the warning and with well-directed coal cleared the front end of the wagon of assailants. Catherine Van Vorst turned her head and saw on the curb of the sidewalk a woman with vivid colouring and flashing black eyes, who was staring with all her soul at the man who had been Freddie Drummond a few minutes before. The windows of the office building became vociferous with applause. A fresh shower of office chairs and filing cabinets descended. The mob had broken through on one side the line of wagons and was advancing. each segregated policeman the centre of a fighting group. The scabs were torn from their seats, the traces of the horses cut, and the frightened animals put in flight. Many policemen crawled under the coal wagon for safety, while the loose horses, with here and there a policeman on their backs or struggling at their heads to hold them, surged across the sidewalk opposite the jam and broke into Market Street. Catherine Van Voorst heard the woman's voice calling in warning. She was back on the curb again and crying out, "Beat it, Bill, now's your time, beat it." The police for the moment had been swept away. Bill Tots leapt to the pavement and made his way to the woman on the sidewalk. Catherine Van Voorst saw her throw her arms around him and kiss him on the lips, and Catherine Van Voorst watched him curiously as he went on down the sidewalk, one arm around the woman, both talking and laughing, and he with a volubility and abandon she could never have dreamed possible. The police were back again and clearing the jam while waiting for reinforcements and new drivers and horses. The mob had done its work and was scattering, and Catherine Van Voorst, still watching, could see the man she had known as Freddie Drummond. He towered a head above the crowd, his arm was still about the woman, and she, in the motor car, watching, saw the pair cross Market Street, cross the slot, and disappear down 3rd Street into the Labour ghetto. In the years that followed, no more lectures were given in the University of California by one Freddie Drummond, and no more books on economics and the labour question appeared over the name of Frederick A. Drummond. On the other hand, there arose a new labour leader, William Tots by name. He it was who married Mary Condon, president of the International Glove Workers Union, number 974, and he it was who called the notorious cooks and waiters strike, which, before its successful termination, brought out with it scores of other unions, among which, of the more remotely allied, were the chicken pickers and the undertakers. And that was the end of part 2 and the end of South of the Slot by Jack London.